The first time my gate rattled, I thought it was just the wind. It was early, maybe 6 in the morning, and I was halfway through a cup of coffee when the iron clang echoed across my driveway. The sound carried sharp against the stillness of the neighborhood, too metallic to be mistaken for anything natural. I set my mug down, walked to the front window, and there she was, Karen. Her Lexus idling crookedly by the curb, her perfectly highlighted bob stiff in the rising sunlight, her arm yanking at my gate like she owned the hinges. She didn't even notice me standing behind the glass. She just slammed it back, harder and harder, until it clanged open enough for her to march through, straight across my property like it was a public park. I didn't say anything the first time. It felt surreal, watching my neighbor act like my boundary was invisible. Maybe she was late for her morning walk and didn't want to take the sidewalk the long way around. Maybe she was one of those early risers who thought the rules of civility switched off before sunrise. I let it go, chalked it up to suburban oddity. But by the third morning in a row, when I heard the same bone-jarring crash of metal on metal, it stopped feeling like an accident and started sounding like a ritual. The rhythm of my mornings wasn't birdsong or lawn sprinklers. It was Karen, smashing my gate open at dawn like she was kicking off a parade in her own honor. When I finally stepped outside to intercept her, she didn't miss a beat. She was mid-stride, yoga mat tucked under her arm, sweat already glistening across her forehead. She stopped just long enough to glare at me with that lethal mix of disbelief and disdain reserved for people she decided didn't matter. "You really should fix this gate," she said, like I was the one creating an inconvenience. "It sticks." Then she shoved it further, scraping metal against the latch, and continued down my driveway to the path that led to the community park. No apology, no acknowledgement that she was trespassing. Just an assumption that my space was hers to rearrange. I stood there, barefoot on the driveway, still holding my coffee mug, and realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. Karen wasn't confused. She wasn't lost. She was entitled. My property line, my gate, my fence, all of it existed in her mind as optional, like fine print she'd already decided not to read. And knowing Karen, that meant one thing: this was going to get worse before it got better. That evening, I checked the HOA handbook. The thing was a brick of paper filled with contradictory clauses, drafted more to give board members power than to create clarity. I knew because Karen was on that board, and if anyone thrived on weaponizing vague language, it was her. There was a line about community access to shared spaces, but it referred explicitly to sidewalks and paths, not private driveways. I circled it in red just to reassure myself I wasn't imagining the obvious. My gate was mine. My property was mine. But logic and entitlement never play on the same field. By the end of the week, the sound of my gate slamming open had become so ingrained in my mornings I could set a clock by it. 6:03 precisely. My dog even started barking at the window as if she were part of the alarm system. The neighbors noticed too. I caught glances from across the street, Mr. Reynolds shaking his head as Karen strutted down my driveway, his wife whispering behind her coffee cup. But no one said anything, because that was the unspoken rule of the HOA. Karen did what Karen wanted, and you learned to live with it. The breaking point came on a Saturday. I had just parked my truck inside the gate, unloading lumber for a backyard project, when Karen arrived for her morning demolition. She didn't slow down when she saw the truck. She didn't pause when she noticed me stacking boards. She walked straight up, shoved the gate open, and it slammed into the bumper with a metallic screech that made me flinch. A fresh dent bloomed on the paint, sharp and ugly. She glanced at it, sniffed, and said, "You shouldn't park so close to the gate. That's just poor planning." Then she kept walking, as if she hadn't just vandalized my property with her bare hands. That was the moment I knew I wasn't dealing with mere arrogance. This was a power play. Karen didn't just want access, she wanted dominance. She wanted the neighborhood to see her as unstoppable, a force that could bend fences and neighbors alike to her convenience. If I let it go, she'd escalate. That's how people like her work. First the gate, then the driveway, then whatever else she decided was community space. The only question was how far she'd go before I pushed back. That night, I started planning. I wasn't the type to yell or storm into HOA meetings with fists clenched and papers waving. That's what she expected. She thrived on confrontation she could twist into her own victim narrative. I had seen her do it to other neighbors, turning her shrieking into official complaints, spinning every argument into harassment claims. No, I had to play this differently. Calm, quiet, invisible. A game she didn't realize she was losing until it was too late. So I inspected the gate. The hinges were sturdy, the latch functional. The weak point wasn't the structure itself. It was Karen's assumption that nothing would resist her. That assumption, I decided, needed to meet reality. I researched pressure latches, motion sensors, even simple mechanical reinforcement. I wanted something that didn't look like a trap, but acted like one. Something that turned her entitlement into embarrassment, something undeniable. The irony of planning an ambush in my own driveway wasn't lost on me. It felt absurd, almost comical, to be strategizing against a suburban yoga enthusiast armed with nothing but a Lexus and a bad attitude. But then again, absurdity was the fuel of HOA life. The following morning, I stood by the window, waiting. 6:03. Her Lexus rolled up, engine humming smugly. She stepped out, adjusted her mat, and marched toward my gate. I had reinforced the latch with a simple spring mechanism the night before, nothing dangerous, just enough resistance to surprise her. She yanked once, twice, then harder, her face contorting as the gate refused to budge. She let out a frustrated grunt that was louder than the birds, then glared around as if someone had personally insulted her. Finally, she threw her weight against it, and the latch snapped open with a crack that sent her stumbling forward onto the driveway. She nearly dropped her yoga mat, caught herself, and immediately scanned the street, cheeks flushed red. For once, she didn't strut away. She hurried as if embarrassed, and I stood behind the glass, coffee in hand, smiling. It wasn't much, just a tiny crack in her armor. But it was enough to prove she could be rattled. Enough to remind me that even the most self-declared queens of the cul-de-sac were still bound by physics. And as I sipped my coffee, I knew one thing. This was only the beginning. Karen wouldn't take the lesson gracefully. She would escalate. And when she did, so would I. The color drained from her face. She turned back to her ruined car, realization dawning that this time, she had nothing. No witnesses to back her story, no loophole to exploit, just hard evidence and harder steel. But Karen wasn't done. I could see it in her eyes even as she called a tow truck, even as neighbors peeked through curtains and whispered. She wasn't retreating. She was recalibrating. She would come back, angrier, more determined, armed with whatever tricks she had left. And as much as I relished the victory, I knew the war was far from over. Because Karen didn't just want access. She wanted control. And she wasn't going to stop until she either had it, or until I stopped her for good. When Karen didn't show up the next morning, I almost thought I had won. The gate sat still, unshaken, and my driveway was blissfully quiet. I sipped my coffee in peace for the first time in weeks, almost giddy at the idea that maybe embarrassment had finally done what reason never could. But that sense of victory lasted only 2 days. On the third morning, her Lexus was back, parked even closer to my gate than before, its headlights glaring into my living room window like a challenge. She didn't just open the gate this time. She slammed it so hard the metal rang like a church bell, as though she wanted the entire block to know she was reclaiming her throne. She must have realized the latch had been tampered with, because after her usual power march through my driveway, she came back the long way around and stood at my fence, arms crossed, waiting for me to step outside. When I finally did, she smiled, but it wasn't the friendly kind. It was the type of smile someone wears when they already think they've won the argument. "I don't know what you did to this gate," she said, her voice sweet like poison, "but it's not allowed. Any modifications to shared access points need board approval." I kept my tone calm, sipping my coffee like I had all the time in the world. It's not shared, Karen. It's my gate, my driveway, my latch. She tilted her head in mock sympathy, as though she were explaining algebra to a toddler. That's not how this works. The path behind your property is community property. If your gate touches it, then it's subject to community access rules. You don't get to decide who comes through. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but I held it in. So let me get this straight. Because my fence borders the park path, you believe you're entitled to march through my driveway whenever you want. Exactly. She brightened, as if I'd finally grasped the obvious. It's called being neighborly. Funny, I said. I always thought being neighborly meant not denting someone's truck with their own gate. Her eyes narrowed at that, and the smile disappeared. She turned without another word, heels clicking against the pavement, but I knew this wasn't over. Karen didn't walk away when she lost. She retreated to reload. The next escalation came in the form of a letter. Official HOA stationery, slipped under my door one evening like a notice of execution. It accused me of obstructing community access and harassing a board member by altering my gate. It demanded I remove the modifications within 7 days or face fines. There was no signature at the bottom, but I didn't need one. The passive-aggressive tone had Karen's fingerprints all over it. I could have contested it directly, but I knew better than to step into her arena. At HOA hearings, facts were irrelevant. It was all about who could shout the loudest and frame themselves as the victim. Karen had perfected that art. So instead I went quiet. I complied. I removed the spring latch. On the surface, I looked like I had surrendered. But in reality, I was laying bait. When the gate swung freely again, Karen returned to her routine with renewed arrogance. Every morning, 6:03, the slam echoed once more. But now I was ready. I had installed a discreet motion-activated camera above the gate, tucked so neatly into the frame it looked like a screw. Every shove, every trespass, every dent-inducing slam was now on record, stored neatly in my cloud account. The footage wasn't for her, not yet. It was for when she inevitably went too far. People like Karen couldn't resist. Sure enough, she escalated again. It was a Thursday when I woke not to the clang of my gate, but to the grinding roar of an engine. I stumbled to the window, half awake, and nearly spilled my coffee when I saw Karen's Lexus nosed halfway into my driveway. She had decided, apparently, that walking across my property was no longer efficient enough. Now she was driving through it. She had swung the gate open so wide it nearly tore the hinges, then powered her car straight down the concrete like it was her personal shortcut to the park entrance. I raced outside, waving my arms. Are you insane? This isn't a road. She rolled her window down with infuriating slowness, sunglasses perched on her nose, and gave me that same condescending smile. It's easier this way. You should be thanking me, really. Fewer footprints on your grass. Then she revved the engine and drove out through the other side of the gate, leaving tire marks across my driveway like skid tattoos. I stood there, stunned, realizing I had just witnessed the suburban equivalent of an invasion. This wasn't trespassing anymore. This was conquest. She wanted to prove there was nothing I could do to stop her. That night, I replayed the footage on my laptop. The sight of her car muscling through my gate, the smug wave as she exited, it made my blood boil, but it also made me smile. Because now I had proof that no HOA clause could twist away. No one could argue her car belonged in my driveway. The next day, I didn't confront her. I didn't send the footage to the board. I didn't even call the police. I waited. Because I knew Karen. She wasn't satisfied with a single victory. She needed repetition, validation, an audience. If she thought she could drive through my property once, she'd do it again. And the second time, she'd push harder. That's when I'd be ready. So I laid my trap. It wasn't elaborate. Just a pair of heavy-duty parking bollards, the kind used to block vehicles from entering pedestrian zones. I set them just inside the gate, painted them the same dull gray as my driveway so they blended in with the early morning light. Removable, for when I needed to park my own truck, but firm enough to stop 2 tons of entitled Lexus from cruising through uninvited. And then I waited. The following morning, right on schedule, her headlights cut across my curtains. I slipped to the window just in time to see her gate slam open, the Lexus inch forward with imperial confidence. She didn't hesitate. She didn't slow down. She barreled forward, until the bumper met steel. The sound was glorious. A hollow, resonant clang followed by the crunch of plastic and the hiss of a punctured radiator. Her car lurched to a stop, hood crumpled against the bollards, steam rising like a signal flare of justice. I opened my front door casually, coffee in hand, as Karen stumbled out of her car, face pale, jaw slack. She looked from the mangled front of her Lexus to me, and for the first time since this whole war began, she had no words. No lecture, no accusation, no victim script. Just stunned silence. I let it hang there for a moment, savoring it. Then I said, calm as ever, looks like the gate stuck again. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She finally managed, you'll pay for this. Funny, I said, nodding toward the camera glinting above the gate. I was about to say the same thing. I walked out of that meeting with more than just relief. I walked out with allies. Neighbors who quietly approached me afterward, thanking me for standing up, sharing their own horror stories about Karen. From lawn disputes to parking wars, she had collected enemies like trophies. And now, for the first time, those enemies were whispering together. As I locked my gate that evening, dog curled at my feet, I realized Karen had lost something far more dangerous than a car or a fine. She had lost control of the narrative. The Queen's crown was slipping, and all I had to do was keep tightening the screws. But deep down, I knew she wasn't done. Karen didn't surrender. She retaliated. And whatever came next, it would be bigger, louder, and nastier than anything so far. The tow truck hauled Karen's Lexus away like a fallen soldier, its hood crumpled, fluids dripping across my driveway. The neighbors had gathered in clusters, some pretending to water their lawns, others openly gawking as the HOA queen herself was dethroned by steel bollards. I should have savored it more. Watching her stand there, arms crossed, face twisted into a mask of humiliation, was the kind of neighborhood theater you couldn't buy tickets for. But I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. She was the type to turn a loss into a campaign. Sure enough, 2 nights later, a letter arrived. This one wasn't just slipped under my door. It was certified mail, stamped with the official HOA seal and signed by every board member. It accused me of creating hazardous obstructions in a shared access point and endangering community members. It demanded immediate removal of the bollards and threatened fines that stacked higher the longer I resisted. I didn't need to read between the lines. Karen had rallied the board to her side. The same people who rolled their eyes at her during neighborhood barbecues suddenly stood shoulder to shoulder with her on paper. That was her true power. She could spin any narrative into righteousness, bully people into signing their names just to make her stop talking. I could have fought the letter directly, but I didn't. Instead, I made copies of my footage. One set for myself, one uploaded to the cloud, and one burned onto a cheap USB stick I slipped into an envelope marked for insurance purposes. I wasn't aiming for the HOA anymore. Karen had bigger weaknesses. Insurance companies didn't care about entitlement, they cared about liability. The next morning, when she stomped down my driveway to confront me about the letter, I was waiting. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. You're going to take those things down, or the board will fine you into bankruptcy. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting her fume. I already sent the footage to your insurance company, I said. You might want to prepare for their call. Her face drained of color. You wouldn't. I did. For once, she didn't have a comeback. She spun on her heel, muttering something under her breath, and stormed back toward her house. That was when I realized I had finally found the chink in her armor. Karen didn't fear rules, or fines, or confrontation. She feared losing money. The HOA was her kingdom, but her Lexus and her manicured lawn and her constant bragging about designer yoga retreats. That was her image, her status. And nothing threatened that faster than a jacked-up insurance premium. But I had underestimated her. A week later, I returned home from work to find the bollards gone. Not just knocked over, completely removed as if they had never existed. My gate hung open, swinging lazily in the wind, and tire tracks carved straight across my driveway. My stomach sank. Karen had escalated from arrogance to sabotage. I marched over to her house, phone in hand, ready to record the confrontation. She answered the door with a smile so wide it was practically an attack. "Oh, hi," she said sweetly. "I noticed your little roadblocks were a danger to children playing nearby, so I did the neighborly thing and had them taken care of." "You mean you trespassed and stole my property?" I said, my voice flat. She shrugged. "Community safety comes first. The board agrees." I stared at her, half expecting her to break into laughter, but she didn't. She believed it. Or at least she convinced herself to. That was her superpower, rewriting reality until even her lies sounded like gospel. I could have called the police, but I didn't. Not yet. Because as much as her theft infuriated me, it also gave me an idea. Karen thought she had stripped me of defense. What she didn't know was that I had already ordered something stronger, something not so easily carted away in the night. 2 days later, the delivery truck dropped off my new toys, retractable bollards, heavy-duty steel posts that rose from the ground with the twist of a key, flush with the driveway when retracted. Karen could smash, shove, or rant all she wanted. She wasn't moving these without industrial tools. Installing them took me an entire Saturday, sweat dripping down my back as I dug, poured concrete, and bolted steel. By sundown, my driveway was armed like a fortress, the bollards invisible until I summoned them upright. The next morning, I didn't even bother waiting by the window. I sat on the porch, coffee steaming in my hand, dog at my feet, as Karen strutted up in her freshly repaired Lexus. She stopped short when she saw me, suspicion flashing across her face. Then she pulled forward anyway, assuming she had scared me into surrender. The moment her bumper neared the gate, I slipped the key into the hidden lock and twisted. With a metallic thunk, the bollards shot up from the ground like teeth, inches from her hood. She slammed on the brakes, tires squealing, her body jolting against the seatbelt. The look on her face was priceless. Shock, fury, disbelief, all battling for dominance. She slammed her hand on the horn, leaning out the window. "This is illegal." I took a slow sip of coffee. "So is driving through someone's property." Neighbors peeked out again, whispering. This time, though, the murmurs weren't just curiosity. I caught nods of approval, smirks poorly hidden behind curtains. People were tired of her reign. I wasn't the only one she'd terrorized. I was just the first to fight back visibly. Karen threw her car into reverse and peeled back onto the street, her face twisted in rage. She didn't return that morning, or the morning after. But I knew she wasn't beaten. She was scheming. Her counterattack arrived in the form of an HOA emergency meeting, summoned with less than 24 hours' notice. The flyer, stuffed in everyone's mailbox, warned of dangerous obstructions threatening the safety of our community children. It didn't name me, but it didn't have to. Everyone knew who the villain in Karen's fairy tale was supposed to be. I showed up anyway. The meeting was held in the community center, folding chairs lined in uneven rows, a coffee urn sputtering in the corner. Karen sat at the front like a queen on her throne, flanked by board members who looked more exhausted than supportive. She launched into a speech about how certain residents were creating hazards, how community trust was at stake, how a spirit of cooperation was being replaced with hostility. When she finally opened the floor, I stood, calm, collected, USB stick in my pocket. "I think the community deserves to see the full picture," I said, and held up a printout, still frames from my footage. Karen driving through my gate. Karen's Lexus crumpled against the bollards. Karen's face frozen in entitled fury. The room erupted in whispers. I didn't need to say much else. The images spoke louder than her monologue ever could. For the first time, Karen looked rattled in public. Her voice cracked as she sputtered excuses about doctored footage and taken out of context. But no one seemed convinced. Karen disappeared for nearly a week after the HOA meeting. Her Lexus wasn't in the driveway, the blinds on her front windows stayed shut, and the usual morning clang of my gate was replaced by blessed silence. For a moment I thought the public embarrassment had finally broken her. Maybe she had gone to lick her wounds at one of those overpriced yoga retreats she loved bragging about. Maybe she was scheming from a distance. Either way, the absence felt almost eerie, like the calm before a storm. But then the letters started. Not HOA letters this time. Anonymous ones, typed, stuffed into my mailbox without a stamp. They accused me of being unneighborly, of harassing respectable community members, of setting a dangerous precedent. They weren't signed, but the cadence was familiar. Karen's words disguised with the thin veil of anonymity. I laughed at first, but after the third letter arrived, accompanied by a rock tossed into my yard, I knew she was back on the offensive. And she didn't come alone. One morning, I stepped outside to find my trash cans tipped over, garbage scattered across the driveway. The next day, my mailbox door was bent, hanging on one hinge. Neighbors who had nodded politely at me after the HOA meeting suddenly crossed the street when they saw me. Karen had begun whispering again, spinning her version of events into rumors that spread faster than the truth. If she couldn't win in the open, she'd wage a guerrilla war from the shadows. I decided not to respond. Not yet. If I lashed out every time she provoked me, I'd look exactly like the villain she wanted me to be. So I documented everything. Photos of the trash, the bent mailbox, the note. I kept a file. Because the longer Karen played dirty, the more ammunition she handed me. But she wasn't satisfied with petty harassment. Her grand move came on a Friday evening. I came home from work to find a group of HOA board members standing in my driveway, clipboards in hand, Karen at the center like a conductor orchestrating chaos. My gate hung wide open, the retractable bollards raised, and she was pointing at them as if she'd discovered a crime scene. "This," she announced, loud enough for the whole street to hear, "is a clear violation of HOA code. Hazardous, unsightly, and unauthorized." I parked my truck slowly, stepped out, and folded my arms. Hazardous to who? The only person trying to drive through my property illegally was you. Karen's smile was brittle, but her voice carried confidence. The board has voted. These obstructions must be removed within 48 hours, or we'll fine you daily until you comply. One of the board members, Mr. Jenkins, a quiet man who had never looked me in the eye, mumbled something about safety concerns. I could see the exhaustion in their faces. They weren't here out of conviction. They were here because Karen had worn them down with relentless pressure. I took a breath, kept my tone measured. Fine me if you want. But just know every cent will be contested. And when this ends up in front of a real judge, the footage will speak louder than your clipboard. Karen's smile faltered. Just slightly, but enough. She spun on her heel and ushered the board members away, muttering about uncooperative residents. But I caught the flicker of worry in her eyes. She was playing chicken with someone who refused to blink. The next escalation wasn't from Karen directly. It was from the county. A notice taped to my door informed me of a complaint filed against my property for unpermitted structures blocking access. Someone had tipped them off, someone who clearly knew exactly how to file paperwork to cause maximum inconvenience. I didn't need to guess who. The inspector showed up 3 days later, clipboard in hand, frown etched deep. He walked the driveway, tapped the bollards, checked the gate. "These are solid," he admitted. "But the complaint says you didn't get a permit." I explained the situation, even showed him the footage. To my surprise, he chuckled. "I've seen worse. Technically, you're in a gray area. These aren't permanent structures. As long as they retract, you might be fine. But, he added, if your HOA keeps pushing, they could make it messy. Karen hadn't just escalated to local gossip. She was dragging the county into it. And that meant she was desperate. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset burn orange over the rooftops, I realized I had reached a crossroad. I could keep playing defense, documenting, countering her moves, staying calm while she flailed louder. Or I could take control of the board she valued so much. Because here's the thing about HOA boards, they thrive on apathy. Most neighbors didn't care who was in charge as long as their lawns passed inspection and the annual dues didn't rise too steeply. Karen had dominated by default, by being the loudest voice in the room. But now people were tired of her. I had seen it in the nods at the meeting, the whispered thank yous afterward. If I pushed at the right angle, I could topple her from the inside. So I started knocking on doors. Not with a megaphone, not with threats, just calm conversations. I explained what Karen had done, showed them the still frames, shared my file of notes and photos. Some neighbors hesitated, afraid of crossing her, but others leaned in with quiet fury. She had ticketed people for parking too close to curbs, fined them for flower beds that didn't meet aesthetic standards, written citations for kids leaving bikes on porches. Everyone had a story. They just needed someone willing to unite them. The more I listened, the more I realized Karen's empire was built on resentment barely held together by fear. And fear collapses when people see it shared. By the end of the week, I had signatures, enough to call for a recall vote. I filed the paperwork with the HOA, attaching every piece of evidence I had. Karen must have seen it coming, because the next morning she was at my gate again. Not smashing it this time, but waiting. When I stepped outside, she tried a new tactic, charm. Listen, she began, her tone sugary. We've gotten off on the wrong foot. We're neighbors. We don't need all this hostility. Why don't we sit down, just you and me, and figure this out? It was almost impressive, the pivot. From queen to diplomat in a single breath. But I wasn't buying it. Funny, I said. You didn't seem interested in figuring it out when you were driving your Lexus through my driveway. Her smile cracked, but she kept it plastered on. If you push this, you'll regret it. I have influence you don't understand. I leaned against the fence, coffee warm in my hand, and looked her dead in the eye. So do I. And the difference is, mine doesn't come from fear. She didn't answer. She just turned, stiff-backed, and marched away. For the first time, she didn't slam the gate. She closed it gently, quietly, as if she already knew the battle was slipping from her grip. But I knew better than to celebrate. Karen wasn't done. The recall vote would be public, dramatic, messy. She would claw, scream, and scheme to keep her power. And if history had taught me anything, it was that Karen saved her worst for when she was cornered. The trap had worked once. Now it was time to build a bigger one, not just for her Lexus, but for her entire reign. The night before the recall vote, the neighborhood felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Curtains twitched, cars slowed at stop signs, whispers carried down sidewalk. People who had barely spoken to each other in years were suddenly allies or enemies, depending on where they stood on one question. Karen. I sat on my porch with my dog, sipping coffee as always, and watched the streetlights flicker on. Karen's house glowed like a fortress across the cul-de-sac, every light blazing, her Lexus freshly washed and gleaming under the driveway floodlight as if the dents and steam clouds of weeks past had been nothing but a bad dream. She was preparing, just like me, but our strategies couldn't have been more different. She rallied through intimidation, through endless calls, through badgering people until they gave in. I rallied through quiet persistence, giving people something Karen never offered, proof and patience. The recall meeting was held in the same community center where she had humiliated herself weeks earlier. Folding chairs lined up in neat rows, coffee urns sputtering, a plate of stale donuts on the side table. The turnout was bigger this time. People who usually avoided HOA meetings like the plague showed up, curiosity written across their faces. They weren't here for policy, they were here for theater. Karen stood at the front, her bob cut stiff with hairspray, her smile wide and brittle. She wore a blazer like she was running for office, papers stacked neatly in front of her. She opened with the confidence of a seasoned politician. "We've all seen how certain residents are trying to divide this community," she declared. "Spreading lies, creating hazards, endangering children. But tonight we stand together against that kind of hostility." Applause rippled, but it was half-hearted, more polite than passionate. Then it was my turn. I didn't make a speech. I didn't need to. I pulled the USB stick from my pocket, plugged it into the projector, and hit play. The room filled with the sound of my gate slamming over and over. The footage of her wrenching it open, denting my truck, striding across my driveway without acknowledgement. Then the climax. Her Lexus barreling through the gate, smashing into the bollards, steam rising. The room gasped, whispers rising into a low hum. I didn't say a word until the clip ended, then simply asked, "This is who's leading us?" The silence was louder than any speech. Karen scrambled, voice high and desperate. "That's out of context. He set me up. This is harassment." But the board members, the same ones she'd bullied into siding with her before, wouldn't meet her eyes. Neighbors who once kept their heads down now stared openly, shaking their heads. The vote was swift. The majority raised their hands to remove her. Even those too afraid to defy her in the past didn't want to be on the wrong side of this spectacle. When the final count was tallied, Karen was officially removed as president. Just like that, her crown fell. But if I thought that would end things, I underestimated her. She didn't storm out. She didn't collapse. She stood, straightened her blazer, and with a voice colder than I'd ever heard said, "Fine. If you don't want me leading you, you'll wish you had when the consequences come." Then she gathered her papers, chin high, and walked out to her Lexus. The room buzzed with relief, people congratulating each other as if a dictator had fallen. But I didn't feel relief. I felt a pit in my stomach. Karen had lost her power, and people like her didn't fade quietly. They exploded. The first sign came 2 days later. A police cruiser pulled into my driveway, lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting casually on their belt. "We got a call," one said. "Something about illegal modifications, endangerment of pedestrians, maybe even tampering with HOA property." Karen. Of course. I invited them in, showed them the footage, the paperwork, the inspector's note. By the time they left, they were shaking their heads. One even muttered, "We get calls like this from her address all the time." Still, the message was clear. She wasn't just whispering anymore. She was escalating to official channels. Then came the vandalism. My fence spray-painted with the word "menace" in sloppy red letters. My tires slashed one night, 4 sharp knives taken to the rubber. Even my dog's water bowl kicked over, spilled across the porch. She never did it directly, of course. Karen was too smart for that. But the timing, the pattern, the simmering rage in her eyes whenever we crossed paths, it wasn't hard to connect the dots. I documented everything, filed reports, even bought extra cameras. But as much as the evidence stacked, I knew the police couldn't sit on my porch every night. Karen was playing the long game, trying to wear me down, hoping the pressure would finally make me crack. Instead, I built another trap. Not for her car this time. For her pride. I found out the HOA bylaws allowed any homeowner to propose new rules, as long as they were voted on by the community. So I drafted one. No resident may use another resident's property for access to community spaces without explicit written permission. Simple, obvious, bulletproof. I presented it at the next meeting, calmly, with the footage again as context. And the neighbors, still riding the high of her downfall, voted unanimously in favor. Now, every morning she marched toward my gate. She wasn't just trespassing. She was violating a rule she no longer had the power to bend. The next time she tried, I was waiting. Camera rolling, bollards raised. She reached for the latch, yanked, and found herself staring at steel. "You can't keep doing this," she shrieked. "Actually," I said, holding up a copy of the freshly passed bylaw, "I can. And now, if you try again, you'll be fined." "Not me. You." Her face twisted into something I hadn't seen before. Not just anger, not just entitlement, fear. The realization that the rules she once weaponized now worked against her. For a week, she avoided my gate, took the long way around like every other sane person. Neighbors began nodding at me openly, even smiling. The tension that had strangled the street loosened, just a little. I almost believed it was over. Until the night I woke to the sound of my dog barking, frantic and wild. I rushed to the window and froze. Karen stood at my gate with a crowbar in her hands. She was jamming it against the latch, grunting, hair disheveled, face twisted in fury. The bollard stood firm, but she wasn't trying to drive through this time. She was trying to destroy. To rip the gate down completely. I grabbed my phone, started recording, and dialed the police. But even as I gave them my address, I couldn't look away. This wasn't the smug, untouchable Karen who smashed my gate at dawn. This was someone unraveling, her entitlement cracking under the weight of losing control. When the cruiser arrived, lights flashing, she didn't even run. She just stood there, crowbar dangling, chest heaving. The officers disarmed her gently, cuffed her, and guided her to the back seat. As they drove off, I stood barefoot in my driveway, gate dented but standing, and realized the war had reached its breaking point. Karen wasn't just my problem anymore. She had become the neighborhood's cautionary tale, her downfall captured not just in whispers but in police reports and video files. And yet, even as relief washed over me, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen had always been resourceful, and a person that entitled never truly gave up. She would fight her charges, spin her story, claw for sympathy. And when she came back, she'd be more dangerous, because she had nothing left to lose. The trap had stopped her car. The bylaws had stopped her games. The police had stopped her crowbar. But what would stop her when she came back with her pride in tatters? That was the question that kept me awake long after the blue lights disappeared down the street. The morning after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood buzzed like a hive. People who had spent years hiding from her dominance now lingered at their fences, openly chatting, trading stories like war veterans who finally realized they weren't alone. Her crowbar stunt had crossed a line nobody could excuse. The footage of her being cuffed at my gate spread quickly, first through text chains, then whispered across porches, until everyone had seen it. For once, it wasn't me against Karen, it was everyone. But if I'd learned anything, it was this. Karen was too stubborn, too prideful to vanish quietly. The system she weaponized so ruthlessly had cracks, and she knew how to crawl through them. Sure enough, within 48 hours, she was back in her house. No charges stuck. Disturbance, the report said, not destruction. Her crowbar was misplaced property, not a weapon. She returned to her fortress across the cul-de-sac with her chin high and her Lexus polished, as though she hadn't been driven away in handcuffs days earlier. The difference now was the silence. Neighbors who once greeted her out of obligation turned their back. The HOA board replaced her seat with a mild-mannered retiree named Mrs. Collins, who seemed more interested in gardening than in governing. Karen wasn't just stripped of power, she was isolated. But that only made her more dangerous. She tried the charm offensive first. Stopping by porches with fake smiles, dropping off cookies that looked store-bought, feigning apologies. Most neighbors refused to open their doors. A few accepted the cookies but tossed them straight in the trash when she walked away. Her desperation bled through the cracks of her act. I watched it unfold like a play I'd already read the script for. Then she pivoted. She couldn't win the neighborhood back, so she went after me harder. Anonymous complaints flooded the county office. Noise violations, unpermitted construction, even accusations that I was running a business from my garage. Inspectors showed up 3 times in 2 weeks, shaking their heads as they left empty-handed. Each time, I greeted them with calm patience, offering coffee and files of documentation. Each time, Karen watched from across the street, pretending to trim her hedges while her eyes burned holes into my driveway. I should have been worn down. Anyone else might have broken under the constant siege. But instead, her persistence sharpened me. She thought I was just a man with a gate and some coffee. What she didn't realize was that I had patience carved from steel. The turning point came one night when I discovered her real weakness. I was walking my dog past her house when I heard her voice, sharper, more frantic than I'd ever heard it, through an open window. She was on the phone, pleading, not commanding. "I can't afford another increase," she said. "You don't understand. My rates are already through the roof. If they cancel me, I'll lose everything. Insurance, of course." Her car had cost a fortune to repair after the bollard collision, and her premiums must have spiked. If the company got wind of her crowbar antics or her constant harassment, they'd drop her. For someone like Karen, whose entire identity was wrapped in appearances, that was worse than jail time. I didn't need to call them myself. I knew better than to cross that line directly. But I could make sure the right people saw the footage. I reached out to a neighbor, Mr. Reynolds, who had worked in claims for 20 years. I showed him everything, every video, every still frame, every report. He nodded slowly, understanding immediately. "If this gets to her provider," he said, "she's finished." The next week, Karen's Lexus vanished again, not because she wanted it to, but because the tow truck came for it. Repossessed, neighbors whispered. Insurance dropped, repairs unpaid. She drove a rented sedan for a while, but the humiliation clung to her like a second skin. The queen of the cul-de-sac, reduced to a renter's car. That should have been the end. But entitlement doesn't die, it mutates. Karen shifted her war indoors. Lights blazed at all hours, arguments leaked through her windows, deliveries piled on her porch only to be returned unopened. She began writing letters again, but this time not to me. To everyone. Thick envelopes filled with accusations, conspiracies, claims that I was manipulating the board, that I had somehow staged everything. Some neighbors laughed and tossed them out. Others grew uneasy, tired of the drama bleeding into their lives. I realized then that she wasn't trying to win anymore. She was trying to scorch the earth. If she couldn't rule the neighborhood, she'd poison it so no one else could enjoy it. The final straw came on a Saturday morning. I woke to find my gate wide open, not smashed this time, but unlocked, swinging idly. My dog barked frantically at the fence line. I stepped outside and froze. Someone had poured a line of salt across my lawn, straight and deliberate, a scar cutting through the grass. Months of care, ruined in a single act of spite. I didn't need to wonder who. The security footage confirmed it. Karen, at 2 a.m, creeping across my yard with a bag slung over her shoulder, sprinkling destruction like some twisted parody of Santa Claus. This time, I didn't just file it away. I took it straight to the police. They watched the footage twice, their expressions hardening. "This isn't a disturbance anymore," one said. "This is malicious mischief. Criminal damage." They filed charges. Real charges, not warnings, not disturbances. Karen was served papers the following week. The sight of the deputy standing on her porch, handing her the envelope while neighbors peeked from behind curtains, was the moment the tide finally turned. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She just stood there, pale and still, clutching the papers like they were written in fire. The neighborhood exhaled. For the first time in months, people mowed their lawns without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Kids rode bikes in the street again. My mornings were silent except for birdsong and coffee steam. The gate stood firm, the bollards gleamed, and Karen's reign seemed finally broken. And yet, I couldn't shake the unease. Because Karen wasn't just a villain, she was a force. Entitlement that pure doesn't vanish with a piece of paper. It festers. It waits. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I saw her sitting on her porch, shoulders hunched, staring at my house. No Lexus, no clipboard, no army of board members. Just Karen, alone, clutching a mug like it might anchor her. For the first time, she didn't look like a queen or a tyrant. She looked like someone cornered by her own pride, stripped of the power she thought would last forever. But I knew that look. It wasn't surrender. It was planning. And as I locked my gate that night, I realized the real trap hadn't been sprung yet. Everything so far, her gate smashing, her Lexus, her crowbar, had been preludes. She had one last card to play. I didn't know what it was. But I knew when it came, it wouldn't just rattle my gate. It would shake the entire neighborhood. I knew Karen wasn't finished, but I didn't know how far she'd go until the night the sirens woke me. Red and blue lights painted my walls, and when I rushed outside, half the neighborhood was already gathered in their driveways. At first, I thought it was another one of her stunts, another noise complaint, another crowbar episode. But then I saw the smoke. Karen's house. A thin column rose from her backyard, curling into the night sky. Firefighters swarmed, hoses blasting arcs of water over her fence. Neighbors whispered frantically, clutching their robes. Some looked worried, others almost relieved. Karen herself stood in the yard, hair wild, robe half-tied, shouting at the firefighters to be careful with her hydrangeas even as flames licked the edges of her shed. When the fire was finally out, it turned out to be contained. A shed burned to blackened rubble, no one hurt. But the whispers spread quickly. She did it herself, someone muttered. Insurance, another said. Whether it was accident or design, no one knew. But the sight of her screaming at first responders while smoke poured into the sky was the final image many neighbors needed to close the book on her. Except Karen didn't close it. She turned it on me. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one wasn't anonymous. It was from her lawyer. She was suing me, claiming harassment, defamation, emotional distress. She accused me of orchestrating the recall, of vandalizing her property, even of starting the fire. The sheer absurdity would have been laughable if the papers hadn't been stamped with an official court seal. I sat at my table, papers spread around me, coffee cooling untouched. This wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. This was war in the legal arena. Karen had lost every other battlefield. My gate, the HOA, the neighbors, the police. Now she wanted to bury me in court, not because she thought she'd win, but because she thought the fight would break me. But she made one mistake. She underestimated just how prepared I was. I called my attorney, handed over the entire archive I'd built for months. Footage, photos, reports, letters, timestamps, even the still frames of her with the crowbar. It wasn't just evidence. It was a dossier, a meticulous record of her campaign of entitlement. My lawyer's eyebrows shot up as he flipped through it. "She's not going to survive this in front of a judge," he said. The court date came 3 months later. By then, the neighborhood had moved on. Lawns mowed, kids laughing, barbecues sizzling. But when the news spread that Karen was dragging me into court, they remembered. A few even showed up to watch. Karen arrived in a crisp suit, hair sprayed into submission, lawyer at her side. She radiated confidence, the same brittle smile plastered on her face. She spoke first, her attorney painting her as the victim of an obsessed neighbor who set traps, stalked her, harassed her into breakdowns. She dabbed her eyes at the right moments, whispered theatrically to her lawyer, cast glances at the judge like a tragic heroine. Then it was my turn. My lawyer didn't make a speech. He simply pressed play. The footage filled the courtroom. Karen smashing my gate, denting my truck, driving her Lexus through my property, crowbar in hand at 2 in the morning, pouring salt across my lawn. Every word of every letter, every photo of every act of vandalism, projected for the judge to see. The room went silent except for the clicks of the remote. Karen's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, whispering frantically. Karen's face, once smug, turned paler with each clip. When it ended, my lawyer said simply, "This is not harassment. This is defense. And frankly, it's restraint." The judge didn't take long. Karen's case was dismissed, labeled frivolous. Worse for her, she was ordered to pay my legal fees. The gavel came down like a thunderclap, and just like that, the war was over. Or at least, the official part was. Karen stormed out, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, her lawyer trailing behind. Outside, neighbors had gathered on the courthouse steps, waiting. Some shook my hand, clapped me on the back, thanked me for standing up to her. Others just watched as Karen climbed into her rental car, slammed the door, and sped away. That was the last time most of us saw her. Within weeks, a for sale sign appeared in her yard. She didn't hold another meeting, didn't bake another batch of store-bought cookies, didn't file another complaint. She simply packed her fortress into boxes, sold the Lexus she could no longer afford, and left. The house sat empty for a while, then sold to a quiet young couple who introduced themselves with actual smiles and a plate of homemade brownies. The neighborhood changed almost overnight. People who had hidden behind curtains now lingered on porches. Barbecues sprouted on weekends, kids laughed in sprinklers, even the HOA meetings turned from battlefields into short, boring affairs about budgets and grass height. Peace felt strange after so much war, but in the best way. As for me, my mornings returned to what they should have been all along. Coffee on the porch, dog at my feet, silence broken only by birdsong. My gate stood strong, my bollards gleamed, and for the first time in months, I didn't flinch at the sound of engines in the street. Sometimes I still think about Karen, about how entitlement had built her entire identity and how, when it cracked, she collapsed with it. She wasn't just my problem, she was a warning. A reminder of what happens when someone believes the world owes them everything and can't handle being told no. Neighbors still bring it up now and then, usually with a laugh. Remember when she drove through your driveway? Or remember the crowbar? It's become a kind of legend, a story passed around at barbecues, exaggerated for effect but always ending with the same moral. Karen met her trap. And in the quiet of my porch, sipping my coffee, I smile at the memory. Not because it was easy, because it wasn't. Not because it was funny, though sometimes it was. But because in the end, calm persistence beat arrogance, patience beat entitlement, and for once, the good guy won. The trap had worked. Not just the steel bollards, or the bylaws, or the cameras. The real trap was time. Waiting her out, documenting, never rising to her bait. Letting her dig her own hole until she couldn't climb out. Karen thought smashing my gate would make her unstoppable. In the end, it only opened the one door she couldn't close, her own downfall. And now, every morning, when I push that gate open gently, coffee steaming in my hand, I think of her. Somewhere out there, probably tormenting another cul-de-sac, still convinced she's the hero of her story. But not here. Not anymore. Here, the gate stays mine. The driveway stays mine. And peace, hard-earned, long delayed, finally belongs to all of us.